There are some people who are not born to live quietly. They come into this world carrying a weight they did not ask for, in a time that will not leave them alone. Before they make a single choice, history is already watching them, measuring them, waiting to see if they will bend. Many of us know that feeling. The feeling of being observed before being understood, of being told, without words, where we are allowed to stand, how loudly we are allowed to speak, how much space we are allowed to take up. The feeling that safety often comes with a condition: stay small, stay silent, stay grateful. But there is a deeper question that follows us through life, whether we name it or not. What happens when silence no longer protects you? What happens when keeping your head down does not save your children from having to lower theirs even further? This story begins long before prisons and speeches, long before crowds and cameras. It begins in that quiet space where an ordinary person first realizes that survival and dignity are not always the same thing. In many African traditions, names are not chosen lightly. A name can be a warning. A name can be a burden. A name can be a mirror held up to the future. Some names are given because they sound beautiful. Others are given because they speak an uncomfortable truth. There are names that suggest peace, and there are names that suggest trouble. Not trouble in the sense of chaos, but trouble in the sense of disruption. The kind of trouble that refuses to accept injustice as normal. The kind of trouble that pulls at the branch instead of pretending the tree is healthy. This is not a story about perfection. It is not a story about a man who always knew the right answer. It is the story of someone who grew up believing, as many of us were taught, that if you learned the rules well enough and followed them carefully enough, the world would eventually make room for you. It is the story of how that belief was tested, broken, and rebuilt into something stronger. As you listen, you may recognize pieces of your own life in it. Moments when you chose patience, moments when you chose endurance, moments when you wondered how much longer you could keep enduring without losing something essential inside yourself. This is not only a story about one man from the southern tip of Africa. It is a story about what it costs to stand upright when the ground beneath you is designed to make you kneel, and why, even after everything has been taken away, some people still refuse to surrender the way they stand in the world. Listen closely, not just to remember what happened, but to remember who we have always been. The name he was born with mattered long before the world learned to pronounce it. In the language of his people, the name Rolilahla carried a quiet warning. It did not mean violence. It did not mean chaos. It meant something subtler and far more dangerous to any system built on obedience. It meant the one who pulls the branch, the one who disturbs what others pretend is stable. He was born into a world where tradition still breathed through daily life. Elders mattered. Stories were currency. Dignity was not granted by paper or law, but by belonging. He learned early what it meant to sit and listen, to observe before speaking, to understand that a person did not stand alone, but inside a long line of ancestors who were watching. Yet, even as a child, he was also being prepared for a different world, a world where his people's authority was shrinking, where outside rules were quietly replacing ancestral ones, where land that had held generations was suddenly marked, measured, and renamed. He grew up moving between these two realities, not fully aware yet that they were on a collision course. Like many children shaped by that moment in history, he was taught adaptation before resistance, respect before challenge, education before confrontation. When he entered school, he was given a new name, one that fit more easily into the mouths of those who held power. It was meant to help him succeed. It was meant to smooth his path. And for a long time, he believed in that promise. He believed that learning the system could protect him, that discipline could earn safety, that if he worked hard enough, spoke carefully enough, and followed the rules closely enough, the future might open itself. There is something deeply familiar in that belief. Many of us were raised on it, told that excellence would shield us, that good behavior would be rewarded, that respectability could become armor. It is a lesson passed down not out of weakness, but out of love, a survival strategy refined over generations. As a young man, he carried himself with quiet confidence. He was observant, composed, and ambitious in a careful way. He was not looking to overturn the world. He was preparing to find his place within it. He imagined a life where education and responsibility would allow him to serve his people without putting everything at risk. What he did not yet understand was that the world he was entering had already made its decision about him. It did not matter how well he spoke. It did not matter how neatly he dressed. It did not matter how deeply he respected the law. There were doors that would never open fully, no matter how politely he knocked. But that realization did not come all at once. It came slowly, through small humiliations and quiet exclusions, through the growing awareness that he was being asked to adapt endlessly to a system that would never adapt to him, that his worth was always conditional, always temporary, always subject to someone else's approval. Still, he did not rebel. Not yet. He watched. He listened. He learned how power moved, how it disguised itself as order, how it trained people to accept limits without ever having to enforce them loudly. These early years did not make him a fighter. They made him patient. And patience, when combined with clarity, can become something far more powerful than anger. The awakening did not arrive like a thunderclap. It did not announce itself with slogans or raised fists. It came quietly, through repetition, through mornings that began with intention and ended with humiliation, through streets where his presence was tolerated but never welcomed, where his movement was always conditional, always monitored. When he arrived in the city, he believed the city would sharpen him. He believed that education, discipline, and professionalism would carve out space where none had existed before. The city promised opportunity, but it delivered instruction of a different kind. It taught him how a system can function perfectly while still being deeply unjust. Here, the rules were clear, and they were merciless. A black man could work, but not rest where he pleased. He could contribute, but not belong. He could obey every regulation and still be treated as a problem waiting to happen. The law did not hide its intentions. It simply dressed them in formality. Every document asked the same question without speaking it aloud. Why are you here? He began to notice how fear was enforced, not through constant violence, but through routine inconvenience. The stops, the questions, the reminders that any sense of normal life could be revoked at a moment's notice. It was not chaos, it was control, refined and efficient. And slowly, something inside him shifted. He met others who refused to accept this arrangement as permanent. Men and women who spoke openly about injustice without whispering. People who were willing to risk comfort for truth. They did not present themselves as heroes. They spoke plainly, urgently, as if time itself were pressing against their backs. From them, he learned a hard truth. The system was not broken. It was working exactly as designed. That realization changed everything. If the rules were built to exclude him, then mastering them would never be enough. If silence kept the machine running smoothly, then silence was not neutrality. It was participation. Each day he remained quiet. He was not protecting himself. He was helping the injustice last longer. This understanding did not make him reckless. It made him restless. He began to see how patience, once a shield, could also become a chain. How waiting for permission could quietly turn into surrender. The respect he had been taught to show was never returned. It was simply expected. He saw older men who had waited their entire lives for the system to soften. He saw how hope can be delayed until it becomes resignation. And he knew, with a clarity that left no room for comfort, that this could not be his future. This was the moment when survival stopped being enough. He did not yet know what action would look like. He only knew that doing nothing was no longer an option he could live with. The question before him was no longer how to succeed within the system, but how to confront it without losing himself. In that moment, his life stopped moving quietly forward. It began to turn. By the time he fully understood the shape of the cage around him, there was no clean way out. The system had been built to force a cruel choice. It did not ask whether a man was good or careful or intelligent. It asked only one thing: would he accept safety without dignity, or dignity without safety? For a long time, he had believed those two could live together. Now he knew better. He saw how the laws did not simply separate people. They trained them. They taught black people where not to walk, where not to sit, where not to dream too loudly. They taught white citizens that this arrangement was normal, even necessary. Apartheid did not rely on constant brutality. It relied on repetition, on habit, on fear quietly absorbed into daily life. As a trained lawyer, he tried to fight within the system. He defended those crushed by its machinery. He listened to stories of families torn apart, of men arrested for existing in the wrong place, of women humiliated for demanding basic respect. Each case added weight to a truth he could no longer ignore. The law was not confused. It was aligned against them, and that knowledge placed him in an impossible position. If he continued to play by the rules, he could build a modest life. He could remain present for his children. He could avoid prison. He could survive. Many advised him to do exactly that, to be careful, to think of his family, to understand that one man could not change a nation. They were not wrong, but they were incomplete. He also saw what silence demanded in return. It demanded that he explain injustice to his children as patience, that he translate humiliation into discipline, that he teach the next generation to endure rather than to stand. That price was too high. Choosing dignity did not feel heroic. It felt heavy. It meant accepting that his life would fracture, that comfort would become a memory, that every step forward would narrow his options rather than expand them. He did not rush toward danger. He walked into it with open eyes. He understood that resistance would not make him popular, that the state would label him a threat, that history might misread his intentions. He accepted that his name would be dragged through courtrooms and newspapers before it was ever spoken with respect. What mattered was not how he would be remembered. What mattered was what he would pass on. By choosing to confront the system directly, he crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He stepped away from the possibility of a quiet life and into the burden of collective responsibility. He did so knowing that the consequences would not fall on him alone, but on everyone who loved him. This was not the moment he became fearless. It was the moment he decided that fear would no longer make his decisions, and from that point forward, nothing in his life would belong to him alone. Prison strips a person down to essentials. It removes routine, choice, and privacy. It replaces them with silence, repetition, and waiting. Days blur together until time itself feels unreliable. For many, that is where resistance ends, not because they lack courage, but because the slow erosion of self becomes unbearable. This is the price the state expected him to pay. His cell was small, bare, designed to remind him, every waking hour, that he was meant to be broken. Hard labor filled his days. The sun burned his eyes. The cold seeped into his bones. There was no relief in the nights, only the quiet awareness of how far life had moved on without him. But the deepest wounds were not physical. They arrived as messages delayed or denied, as funerals he was not allowed to attend, as the knowledge that his children were growing up without his voice, learning the world without his guidance. Each loss carried a quiet question. Was this sacrifice worth it? Prison offered him an easier path. All he had to do was harden himself, to let bitterness take root, to turn inward and survive by shrinking. Many men before him had done exactly that. They emerged older, angrier, and hollowed out. He refused. Instead, he imposed discipline where the prison offered chaos. He woke with intention. He carried himself with dignity, even when no one seemed to be watching. He chose his words carefully, understanding that language was one of the few tools still available to him. He treated guards as human beings, not because they deserved kindness, but because he refused to let hatred define his character. He read, he studied, he listened. He learned how to hold his anger without letting it consume him. This was not passive endurance. It was active resistance of a different kind. He understood something critical. If the prison succeeded in changing who he was, then the state would have won far more than a conviction. It would have rewritten his spirit. So he guarded that spirit with the same seriousness he once reserved for law and strategy. Years passed. His body weakened, but his presence did not. Younger prisoners looked to him, not for instructions, but for example. They watched how he spoke, how he waited, how he chose patience without surrender. In that confined space, he learned the final lesson of freedom, that a man can be confined without being conquered. That dignity, once claimed, cannot be taken without consent, and that the longest battles are not fought against walls or bars, but against the temptation to give up who you are when no one would blame you for doing so. While he remained locked behind concrete and steel, the world outside began to change its posture. At first, the shift was barely noticeable. A mention here, a question there. His name moved quietly, carried by people who had never met him, and never would. Students, clergy, workers, elders who recognized something familiar in his story long before headlines did. He did not control this transformation. He did not design it, but it happened all the same. The longer he remained imprisoned, without surrendering his dignity, the harder it became for the world to ignore the contrast. On one side stood a powerful state insisting it was preserving order. On the other stood a man who had lost nearly everything, yet refused to become small. That contrast spoke louder than any speech. From his cell, he learned that influence does not always require movement, that sometimes staying in place with integrity can unsettle an entire system. His restraint became a form of pressure. His consistency became a mirror held up to the regime itself. He did not present himself as a martyr. He did not beg for sympathy. He simply remained visible in the most dangerous way possible as a human being who could not be reduced to a stereotype. International attention followed, not because he demanded it, but because injustice exposed itself through him. Every year he remained imprisoned made the question harder to dismiss. If he was truly dangerous, why did his words carry such calm? If he was truly a criminal, why did his example inspire such discipline? The answers embarrassed those in power. Inside the prison, he stayed focused. He knew that becoming a symbol carried its own risks. Symbols can be simplified, sanitized, used. He guarded against that by remaining grounded, reminding himself that he was not an idea, but a man accountable to his people and to his conscience. Others began to see in him what they had been told did not exist: leadership without cruelty, strength without spectacle, resistance without surrender. His captivity transformed him into a bridge between generations, between continents, between those who believed change required violence and those who feared it could never come at all. He showed that dignity could travel farther than anger, and patience could outlast force. This was not soft power in the shallow sense. It was power rooted in moral clarity. And once that kind of power enters the world, no wall is thick enough to contain it. When the gates finally opened, freedom did not arrive gently. He stepped into a country balanced on the edge of something dangerous. Decades of anger lived just beneath the surface. Pain had been inherited, multiplied, and stored away. Many believed that justice now demanded retaliation, that history required payment in kind. No one would have blamed him for agreeing. He had lost years that could never be returned. He had buried loved ones without goodbye. He had watched his youth disappear behind walls, built to erase him. If anyone had earned the right to rage, it was him. And yet, he paused. He understood something that few wanted to hear. Violence might satisfy the moment, but it would poison the future. Revenge could feel like balance, but it would create new graves, new prisons, new children taught to carry anger like inheritance. He chose a harder path. Instead of speaking to the past, he spoke to what the country could still become. Instead of demanding humiliation, he demanded coexistence. This was not forgiveness born of forgetfulness. It was forgiveness forged through clarity. He knew that a nation could not be rebuilt on fear alone, that freedom without restraint would only reverse the roles, not end the cycle. His decision confused his enemies and unsettled some of his allies. Many wondered whether restraint meant weakness. It did not. It meant responsibility. He carried the weight of knowing that every word he spoke could calm or ignite millions, that every gesture would be interpreted as permission. So he chose his words the way he once chose his steps in prison, carefully, deliberately, with the long view always in mind. This was not politics as performance. It was leadership as guardianship. He invited former enemies into dialogue, not because they deserved comfort, but because the future required it. He refused to let victory turn into domination. He insisted that dignity could not be selective if it was to mean anything at all. By choosing reconciliation, he denied hatred its final victory. He proved that strength could be expressed through restraint, and that courage sometimes looks like standing still when the world expects you to strike. In doing so, he transformed release from prison into something far greater than personal freedom. He transformed it into a turning point for a nation. After the first rush of celebration faded, the work began. Freedom had opened the door, but it had not cleaned the house. The country he now helped lead was deeply uneven, shaped by decades of separation and deliberate neglect. Wealth and poverty lived side by side, divided not by effort, but by history. Expectations were enormous, and patience was thin. Many believed leadership meant punishment. They wanted visible reversals, public reckonings, clear winners and losers. They wanted proof that suffering had been acknowledged, measured, and answered. He understood that desire. It was human. It was earned. But he also understood its danger. He knew that power, once gained, tests the soul more fiercely than prison ever could. That holding authority can quietly undo the very values that helped a person survive oppression. So he chose to lead differently. He governed with the awareness that he was temporary. He spoke often of unity, not as a slogan, but as a necessity. He reminded the nation that replacing one form of domination with another would not heal it. That dignity could not be rationed along old lines. That justice had to be paired with restraint, or it would curdle into something else. Perhaps his most radical act was knowing when to step away. In a world where power clings tightly to those who taste it, he prepared his exit early. He made it clear that leadership was service, not entitlement, that no individual was meant to become larger than the nation itself. This decision confused many observers. Some saw it as missed opportunity. Others called it naive. But to those who understood the long view, it was consistent with everything he had lived. He had never fought to be above others. He had fought to stand alongside them. His legacy does not rest in perfection. It rests in posture, in the way he demonstrated that survival does not require bitterness, that victory does not require humiliation, and that strength does not require permanence. For many people of African descent, especially those who have lived long enough to see promises made and broken, his life offers something rare, not a guarantee, but a standard. A reminder that even within systems designed to bend us, it is still possible to choose how we stand, to decide what we pass on, to leave behind not just memory, but orientation. History will argue over his decisions. That is inevitable. What cannot be argued is this: he showed the world that dignity can outlive injustice, and that a people long told to bow could rise without becoming what once oppressed them. And that lesson remains, waiting to be remembered. In the end, what Nelson Mandela left behind was not a perfect country, nor a finished story. What he left behind was a way of standing. He showed the world that history does not only move through armies and laws, but through posture, through the quiet decisions a person makes when no one is certain what the outcome will be, through the choice to remain human when circumstances offer every excuse not to be. Mandela's life reminds us that dignity is not something granted at the end of suffering. It is something practiced during it. That freedom is not proven by how loudly one celebrates victory, but by how carefully one treats power once it is finally within reach. For those who have lived long enough to see cycles repeat, his story carries particular weight. It speaks to parents and grandparents who learned to endure without applause, to people who were told to wait patiently, to work twice as hard, to keep faith even when faith was tested daily. This is why his name continues to surface in quiet moments, long after the ceremonies have ended, not as a myth, but as a reference point, a reminder that African history is not only about suffering, but about survival, shaped by choice. In a long record of historical facts, Mandela stands not because he was without flaws, but because he refused to let those flaws define the direction of his life. His journey belongs among the great history legends, not because it promises easy answers, but because it offers orientation when the path feels uncertain. For many listeners, this is the kind of story shared late at night, when reflection comes easier than argument, a story not meant to provoke anger, but calm, not meant to rush, but to steady the mind. In that sense, it carries the quiet rhythm of history for sleep, allowing memory to settle where it belongs. This is Black history not as spectacle, but as inheritance. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: even when the world is designed to make you kneel, you still get to decide how you stand. That choice, once made, can echo far beyond a single lifetime.